Now we're going to look at the steering on this thing, and it is stick steering. Normally when you're just sitting here, it's really easy to move this steering lever back and forth. You know, Pinky can do it. Even back of Pinky can do it. So this is really easy, but I'm having a problem that's similar to what everybody reports, is that it's stiff to steer when you're at power. And that appears to be related to the water blasting through the nozzle. And when you're trying to turn the nozzle, when there's all that force from the water blasting through there, then it gets more difficult. But it wasn't difficult like this when the boat was new. It only stiffened up after a while. And what other people report is that that stiffness comes from grit that's in the pivot points on the nozzle. So I'm going to investigate and find out whether that's true in this case, because other people have found that if they grease those pivot points, then everything is good. So now we'll see what happens. First thing we're going to do is get some relative lengths for leverage positions. So this stick moves back and forth. I don't know for sure where the pivot point is, so I don't know how long that lever arm actually is. So I'll just look across through here, and you can see the pivot point is actually just above the floor, you know, an inch or two above the floor. So that lever arm is pretty long. Now here we are measuring the lever arm, and it could be 35. And here we are at the nozzle. You can see I've got this 2x4 jammed in there, and need a length here from this pivot point out to here. If instead of using 35 inches, we use 17.5, then we'll have a nice handy ratio of lengths. So if I dangle 10 pounds off of this at 17.5 inches, and then it should take 5 pounds at 35 inches at the helm to lift it if there's no resistance in the system. So what I'll do is just drill a hole right here at like 17.5 inches, and then run a cable from here over to this pulley, and that'll give us our sideways weight. That will mimic the sideways force when you're trying to steer at full throttle. Now we've got an eye bolt in this 2x4, this rope, going over this pulley and down to this 10-pound weight. So now we'll climb up into the helm and see if this is really difficult or if it's easy. Theoretically, at the helm, it should only be 5 pounds of force to overcome this 10 pounds of weight relative to the baseline, whatever that was. Well, that was difficult enough that I actually didn't complete the test. I didn't make the lever move, so I dropped the weight down from 10 pounds down to 5 pounds, and now maybe we'll actually be able to complete this without worrying about bending the steering lever off. Now here I am at the helm, and I can in fact move this with just my thumb, but that's just barely. And recall that I have twice the leverage position here that the weight has at the back. So with 5 pounds back there, it should be only 2.5 pounds here, but it's a lot more than 2.5 pounds. So we're going to hook up the other pulley here and see if we can't get a measure on exactly what's happening. Now here we are at the helm again, and I've got this rope tied to the top of the steering lever, and the rope goes over here to this pulley, then goes down to here, and we got 20 pounds hanging off of this, and it's not quite moving. It's real close, but not quite. And we have 5 pounds loaded at the back of the boat, so we've got 5 into 20, so that's 4 times as much force. But recall that we, because of our leverage position, we've got a better leverage position up here at the helm. Then what we're actually doing is magnifying that force at the back by a factor of 8. So let's see what happens here. You know, if I push it, yeah, then it wants to go. But we'll just say that it's about back to Pinky strength. You know, yeah, it's about Pinky strength. So we'll just say that this 20 gets us 5, and then the leverage position means that we actually, if we had a fair leverage position between this and the back, if the leverage position was equal, then we'd have 40 pounds there instead of the 20. So this is multiplying everything by a factor of 8. So resistance at the pump is magnified by this whole leverage system by a lot. And so the question is, where exactly? Is it in the cable? Is it in some linkage somewhere? Or is it just in the pivots that other people have found to be the problem point? Now here for completeness, I decided to add 2.5 more pounds on the back of the boat and see what happens. And now you can see I added another 10-pound plate here. So 2.5 in the back, 10 in the front. And now if I push here, I can make it go. So we'll call that another factor of 4 plus a leverage difference of 2. So again, it's about a factor of 8. So there's a lot of resistance that's piling up in the linkage system. And it looks like it's about linear too. So for even more completeness, I added another 2.5 pounds to the back of the boat and added another 10-pound plate here, so I'm up to 40 pounds. And so that means I've got 10 pounds dangling from the back of the boat, 40 pounds here. That's about a factor of 4 plus the leverage multiplier of 2. So this is the whole linkage system is multiplying that force by about a factor of 8. And if I push here with, finger strength, I can get this to go. So we'll just call it a factor of 8. So somehow we need to make this a lot less than that, because we'd like to see the force at the back be imperceptible at the helm. Okay, here we are with the reverse bucket on the floor, and here's the pump, and now I've got some vice grips attached to the steering arm, or whatever you want to call it. So this guy rotates and makes the nozzle move back and forth. And now I've loaded this up with weights at that end. So now the load is not here, so the load is not being transmitted through these pivot points. Instead, it's just on the vice grips, and that lever arm is about 8 inches, which is roughly half of what the other lever arm was. So if we go up to the helm, this should be really easy to move. We should be able to move it with 20 pounds of force if the resistance through the whole system has not changed. So let's go take a look. Now here we are at the helm again, and the pivots have been taken out of the system. So the weight is just dangling off of the steering arm or lever or whatever you want to call it, poking out the back of the boat. And now we only got an 8-inch lever arm back there, but we can still tell something. And see, I've got 5 pounds dangling here, and right in this vicinity on the stick, the weights are actually on the ground, so I'm not moving the weight. And we come in here, and somewhere in there it starts to lift. I really can't tell where the weight is coming off the ground, so there's just a little bit of force in the system, and so this 5 pounds is plenty to make it happen. So 5 compared to 40 before, that would be like well, because the lever arm is only half what it was, that would be like 10 now. So I've taken a factor of 4 out of the thing, so it feels like most of the resistance is in those pivot points. There may be some in the rest of the system, but not that much. So this is really easy, where it would have been impossible to steer before. Well, here we are with the nozzle in hand, and you can see the pivot points are here and under there, the pivots around that, and then the steering lever kebab pokes into here and makes this rotate back and forth. Here's that little kebab, so that guy moves back and forth. It makes the steering turn left and right. And we have these bolts go in here, and the bolt has this O-ring, and the manual states that the O-ring is to keep grit out of this bushing space. So that O-ring actually sits down below, so it's going to keep the high pressure water from the pump from squeezing past the O-ring into this gap and collecting grit in here. When I took this apart, there was really no grit that I noticed at all. There may have been some, but as I took it apart, the Loctite stuff kind of came apart, and so that made a little bit of debris. So it was hard to say that there was no grit in there, but there wasn't any obvious grit. So there must be just some little teeny piece in there. And then this guy drops all the way down in here, and then it fits well so that this. Let's see if I push it down. Okay, so there's supposed to be, when the whole thing is bolted together, this gap right here is supposed to be 1/10 of a millimeter, and the space between the bolt and the inside of the bushing is about what was it? About 2/10 of a millimeter. So if this is 1/10 of a millimeter space here, then it will let in grit that would be about the same diameter as the difference in thickness between this and the inside diameter of that. So, it's not a completely foolproof system, but it wasn't all gritty inside. So there's just some tiny pieces getting by, or maybe this O-ring might be getting dried out, or I don't know. I'll have to think about this more. But anyway, I'm running out of time, so a lot of people will either tap out this bolt and then have some have a grease fitting on here, and they can just grease the thing. And some even have permanent hoses running into their boat, particularly people that are running the salmon all the time. The salmon is a real gritty river, so they haven't found a way around this other than to just grease it all the time. And if they leave their boat in the water all the time, like some guides do, then they need to be able to grease it without jumping in the water. So they have hoses, permanent grease hoses running to their pumps so they can grease these out. And so I'm just going to do what the manual says and put it back together the way the manual says and see how long it lasts me. I don't keep the boat in the water all the time, and maybe it'll last a long time, I don't know. Another interesting thing too is this washer is supposed to be a specific thickness so that when it's set in here, there will be only that 1/10 of a millimeter gap. So if you end up with the wrong washer, or you just grab a washer off the shelf and drop it in there, then part of the sealing system, if you want to call it that, will be defeated. So you just want to make sure that this washer is the correct one. Okay, I decided to look at these little grooves right here, and grit that got into the pump. So the grit gets in there, then the nozzle sits in here like this. The nozzle rotates back and forth and grinds away the paint on. And so I was concerned, well, maybe there were some little shoulders on those grooves, and they might be binding on the nozzle. Well, it turns out that's incorrect. This part of the nozzle is kind of rough from grit going by, but it normally does not contact this part here. So normally it's really not an issue. If you have a piece of grit that got stuck in there, yeah, it's going to make things a little stiffer, but normally it's not an issue. Here I took the O-ring out, and it looks fine. I'm not seeing or feeling any damage or roughness on it. And this guy that goes inside, this groove that it runs in, that's actually got little tiny ridges in there. Well, not really ridges, it's just flat spots, so it wasn't designed to be round. So I think the idea is that the O-ring will bind on those flat spots, so the O-ring won't rotate on this. Instead, the O-ring is going to rotate. It's going to stick to this guy, and it's going to rotate inside of this brass fitting. I think that's the idea. Yeah, another point here is see how clean this part is. I didn't clean this at all. I put no effort into cleaning it. So you can see that whatever grit was there, there wasn't much. You can look into this brass guy here, you can see there, there's a little bit of wear tracks where some piece of grit got in there and was running around the, as I was steering. It's a little bit shinier right there, but it's, I can't feel it with my fingernail, so it's not like it's real deep. And a place where grit is going to get in is, this fitting normally pokes up in here like this, and the sand will probably get in around this, particularly on the back. You can see that it looks like there's a lot of little pieces of grit showed up there, and then ended up getting ground by the nozzle. Probably for some kind of design change, what you need to do is put some kind of seal on this thing and have some kind of flat surface here in here rather than this kind of sloped surface. Then you might be able to actually keep the grit out a little better. Because this the O-ring fits right in here, and it does come up most of the way. So when it's operating optimally, it should keep most of the grit out, but that's should and most, which is different than saying it will keep all the grit out. So just for the hell of it, I decided to compare this O-ring against some O-ring sets that I already had, these Harbor Freight sets, where you get like 50 billion O-rings for 49 cents. And these green ones, they feel like they're a little harder than the Hamilton O-ring. Of course, they're not exactly the right size. If they were exactly the right size, that would be an actual miracle. An actual miracle, not just sort of a miracle, an actual miracle. And these brown ones, they're a little squishier, I think, than the Hamilton. That one's actually pretty close to the right size. In a pinch, maybe it would work. But this is not a pinch, I don't think. Okay, I greased the crap out of this thing with some of this waterproof grease. This is actually for faucets, like for your kitchen sink. We don't need really a high pressure grease because this is not a spinning bearing. It just moves back and forth sometimes when you're steering. So this is actually a lot more like a faucet for your kitchen than like wheel bearings on your trailer. And I've got this board stuck in the nozzle there again with the weights dangling over there. That's 10 pounds of weights, and we'll go see how easy this is now. Hopefully it'll be really, really easy. So here I am at the helm again, and now instead of the 40 pounds that I had on there before, or whatever it was, I've got 10 pounds on here, and this will make the thing move for a little while, but then it kind of sticks up again. So it so it appears that the greasing the pivot point has really helped, but maybe only through part of the throw. I'll get another weight on here. So we'll add another 10 pounds and see what happens. And that helps it get through there. I can almost make it move. I guess I can make it move with finger strength. Definitely not with pinky strength. So, it really helped a lot out at the end of the throw, but not so much in the middle of the throw. So, with just that 10 pounds of force on the back there, we wouldn't expect this much resistance, because recall that my lever arm here is twice what the lever arm is on the nozzle. So yeah, there's an improvement, but there's still a way to go. So what does that mean? Well, that means we're going to dig a little deeper. And for you fishing purists, you'll like my fishing equipment. I've got this Sport Fisher spin cast reel and my Zebco pole. And it's one of these collapsible poles, and there's a rooster tail on the end there. Yeah, you can tell I'm really into the fishing thing. I'm an expert. Okay, the steering mechanism is down at the bottom of this steering stick. And so to get at that a little better, I need to rip up the floor, and which means I need to remove this air ride seat that I installed. I installed it, I decided to replace the jump seat that was here. I decided there was plenty of room for this air ride. And so I built this bracket to hold this seat up and then repurposed the connector for the jump seat right here. So this whole thing will just pull one pin and the whole seat pops out, but you got to remember to disconnect this wire because it has its own air pump that's inside the seat because this, yeah, it's an air ride. Anyway, this thing works pretty well. I bought the this base off of, I think, eBay, and then this is a Bostrom seat that seems to work pretty well. So you just buy them separately, then you got to figure out how to put them together, you know. So I made some bracket in here to kind of put the two together, and it seems to work out okay. Yeah, you notice it has these two little feet on this side, so you can poke stuff under that and use it for storage, whatever. Okay, so here I am sitting beside the seat. The seat is kind of jacked up here above the floor, and here's where the stick was. So I've disconnected it. This wire is the windshield wiper wire. So here I can move the stick back and forth with my fingers, and if you look down below here, then you can see I'm moving that lever down below, and you can see there's actually two cables. There's this cable that goes that way, and then there's a cable on the other side that goes that way. So it goes over there. So these are pretty darn big cables, you know. They're finger thickness, you know. So these things are heavy. I kind of looked this kind of cable up on the internet. Yeah, they're rated for well over 1,000 pounds. So it might be argued that these are overkill. I don't know. And so we'll measure how difficult this is. Pinky can make this move, but it's really difficult for Pinky to do it. So Pinky's leverage isn't real good because most of the stick is gone. But you know, if you got from this, and your rotation point is about there, and you've got the lever arm down here, so Pinky still does have some leverage over the system, and Pinky's having trouble. So there's something in there, and no, there's no weight hanging off the back of the nozzle. And here's how the steering appears on the back of the boat. You can see the cables. There's a cable that comes in there, and another cable that comes in there. So there's the two cables. And an interesting feature about this dual cable system is that if one spontaneously adjusts itself gradually over the time, and the other one does not, then they start to jam against each other, and pretty soon they don't work at all. So this is like having two nuts on one bolt. If you want to move them and they're not jammed against each other, you can move both of them simultaneously easily. But if they jam against each other, then neither will move. And so that's kind of what happens. And then you'll just notice that it kind of binds all the time. And for you 6.2 DI guys, there's this plastic cover on top of the engine. I've been laying on that all the time when I climb down here to do stuff, like when I was working on the brake box. So here I am laying on top of the engine, and you know, I weigh like 200 pounds, and I've seen other bigger guys lay on the engine. You know, it's not a problem, and this makes it really easy to get in here and work on. You know, a lot easier than reaching over the side. To determine whether these cables are jammed against each other, you can just come in here and grab this little lever arm and kind of wiggle them back and forth, and you see there's some slop right in here, and it's really easy to move through that slop. And if the cables were jammed against each other, there wouldn't be that slop. So really, the two cable system depends on a little bit of slop in the system. If the slop is gone, it's going to be jammed. So the way you adjust it is you just come over here to these adjusting nuts, and then you turn this thing, which I don't know if you can see it, and maybe you can see it on this silicone. So it's the adjusting nut is turning this rod and moving it in or out. And then when you adjust it, you want to make sure it remains centered. Otherwise, you may be bumping up against a a motion restriction, say at the stick, at the helm? And if so, then you have to adjust both of them simultaneously to make it so it's not bumping against some sort of stop. So I made sure these cables aren't bound, and they're not. You know, Pinky's still having trouble moving the thing. So it's there is some resistance in the cable. So what I'm thinking I'm going to do here is just remove one of the cables. Both of these cables are push-pull cables, which means push and pull. So both of them are perfectly capable of pushing and pulling. You don't need two. So I think what I'll do is just take one off and then just kind of leave it sit to the side. And then if one cable the other cable ever breaks, then I'll have a fresh cable. So the question is which cable to remove. And well, it turns out this one is a lot longer and it has more bends in it because it's the one that goes forward at the helm. So it goes up through the bow, makes a 180-degree turn, and then comes back down here. So it's probably contributing the majority of the resistance in the system. And another question is, well, what's the easiest way to take this cable off? And there's this bolt that goes through this arm. That bolt is holding both these guys on. And, you know, so that's a little bit of a pain in the ass. But there's this pin right here that's holding the end of the cable in place, and then it's just got this cotter thing. So it looks like if I just pull that pin out, then I'm good. And I'll have to do that at the other end too. So here's the little thingy that I removed, the cotter pin guy and whatever. So I did this on both ends of the cable to remove the longer cable. And you can see down in here, there's this nut on here, and if this nut is tightened onto these threads, then the whole cable wants to rotate when you turn this thing. And so that's basically how you lock your setting in place once you've decided where you want this to be. So anyway, I loosened this up, so now I can rotate this guy, and you can see this guy's gradually going that way, and then that'll just completely take it out of the way, so we don't have to worry about it bumping into the bottom of the stick. I've disconnected that cable at both ends, so I'm just working with one cable. So I've probably taken 2/3 of the resistance out of the thing. So, you know, Pinky can do this a lot easier. So it feels like there's a lot less resistance in the cable, but the resistance in the unloaded cable really isn't all that interesting. What matters is when you load it up, because it tends to multiply the force that's being applied. Okay, here I am back at the helm, and I removed one of the cables, and recall that I also lubed the pivot points on the nozzle, and now I've got 20 pounds here dangling, and instead of 40 or whatever it was, you know, and I can make it go pretty easily, and it's smooth through the throw, so there's not like a catch point. It sure would be nice if it was a little easier than this, because I've only got 10 pounds off the back, and I've got twice the leverage here. So there's still room for improvement, so maybe we'll dig even deeper. And with one of the cables removed, there's a little bit more slop in the system, so I came in here and modified this and ground this out a little bit so that I would get a little bit more throw in the cable, in the stick. Also, a good thing for carving out aluminum is just a drywall bit like this. They hold up really well, and this is just on a Dremel. Okay, here I am back in the engine compartment. I'm trying to get a better feel for how much of the resistance is in the nozzle and how much is in the cable. And this time I've got 5 pounds hanging off the nozzle like before, and you know, that 5 pounds has 17 inches of leverage. So if I just grab a hold of the lever and try to move it, I'm likely to be unsuccessful because that lever is so short. But if I put this wrench on here, maybe I can move it. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, you know, it's pretty difficult. So, you know, this is leading me to believe that a lot of the resistance is in the nozzle pivot still, you know. and that the cable, you know, it's probably okay. All right, here's a tip for these little strut thingies. They have this kind of key thing on the end here. You just pull that out with a screwdriver, and then the strut pops off this little nub that it's attached to, and you just tap that back in when you want the strut to stay in place. Okay, here I am on a test drive out on a lake, and yeah, it's a lot easier to steer. So probably some of the easiness comes from lubing the pivot points, some from replacing the cable. It's hard to say for sure which goes where. If the pivot points are super free to move, then you're not going to notice any resistance in the cable, because the cable is a multiplier on whatever the pivot resistance is. So if you grease that, then you're great, but you still may have a really stiff cable. You won't find out though until the pivot points lose the grease and start stiffening up again. Anyway, you know, we'll see how this works out. So far it's good. You know, overall, you know, the whole thing kind of crept up on me, where the steering was getting stiffer and the reverse bucket was getting stiffer, and you don't really notice that it's really affecting your performance, you know, and your desire to even go boating. But when it's all working, you know, you back off the trailer and you go, wait a minute, this is actually really easy. You know, it's not hard. I don't have to wonder if I'm going to have to throw 100 pounds of weight on the steering, or 200 pounds of weight on the reverse bucket. You know, it's all just easy, and it's just a lot better. And this should really be a focus, generally speaking. So when I was on the test drive, I noticed again that it's easier to push the steering lever forward at the end of the throw than it is to pull it at the end of the throw. And so I was thinking, well, you know, that's kind of an asymmetry. You know, where might that asymmetry come from? Because it's really, it doesn't look like it could come from the pump itself. Well, it turns out it's probably from the orientation of this cable coming in here. And you can see, so here's the steering lever arm all the way in one direction, and here it is all the way in the other direction. And you notice this angle is this thing is going to push most efficiently when this angle is exactly at 90 degrees, which happens a little bit past top of center here. So it's going to be a little easier to push it all the way to the end of the throw than it will be to pull it to the end of the throw. And you can see, well, you know, this cable comes here at this angle, so part of the force generated is going to rotate this lever arm, but part of the force is also going to be trying to stretch the lever arm, you know, which isn't going to be accomplishing anything. So that's why it's a little bit more difficult to pull at the end of the throw than to push. Now, if this cable was coming in at an even steeper angle, then it would be even worse. So that's just something to bear in mind. You know, this is, you know, it's not too bad. I'd have to move this thing down a bit. You know, there's really not a lot of room to lower this because the exhaust pipe is in the way. But you know, that's just something to think about, you know, maybe in the future.